This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Today's panel is going to take a look at a few issues. We're certainly going to talk about DOGE and cutting the budget, but we're going to spend a significant amount of our time today talking about the emerging world order and what seems to be happening in the war with Ukraine. It seems to me that a lot of what's been happening on the right and the left has been that they've been driven by the politics of pessimism. They tend to have this belief that the United States is a declining power and that we're in trouble. That's had a huge effect on decisions that are being made. Now, we just wrote a book called What's Right with America. And the whole idea of this book is to try to point out how the United States is in an exemplary position, that we should be very optimistic about where we are today. And it's filled with data and facts that tries to build this point. Any of the revenue that comes from that, we're putting right back into the whole concept of trying to ensure that Americans are more optimistic, because we believe that has a big effect on public policy. In any event, I'm just an ordinary optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. If you like what it is that we're doing, pre-order our book on Amazon. It's there today. Or push that subscribe button and let's get on with the show.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, so let me start with just saying hello to my panel. I'd like to thank all of them for being here. I'll start with Elliott Pollack, who seems to be just kind of finishing. He said his breakfast, but it's like 3 o'clock or something like that. Now, what's going on there, Elliott?
It's a long story.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that. All right, Henry, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm not a hobbit like Elliott. I don't eat 3 breakfasts a day.
Yeah. I keep saying he's carbo loading. He's trying to build up those biceps. I'm pretty sure. So, and then finally, my favorite columnist, Bob Robb. We're going to be talking today about your particular article, the one that you just wrote this week on Ukraine. We're going to put a big focus on that. But before we do, let me start with a video of what happened last week between Zelensky and Trump. Now, if you haven't seen this, I don't know what you were doing, because it was like wall to wall and it was a big game changer. But we'll just play a few minutes here.
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Wait a minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet.
You haven't been alone. We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. We gave you military equipment, and your men are brave, but they had to use our military.
What about
if you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days. I heard it from Putin. In 3 days.
All right. So with what's happening in the rest of the world, Bob had written an article last week, and I believe the article was actually written before the big event that happened between Zelensky and the president. But one of the things that you said in your article, Bob, that I thought was at least interesting, was you took a position that the United States had just lost its position as being the leader of the free world. Now, I'm going to tell one little story because I know that, I've been trying really hard to be an optimist, even on this one. I remember back during my son's campaign when he ran for the city council, which thank God he didn't win. But nonetheless, when he was running for city council, I went out and I was knocking on doors for him. And I got to this one guy's door and he opened up the door and I said, "Hey, I'm Paul Johnson. I'm here campaigning for my son, Justin Johnson." He interrupted me. He says, "Yeah, I know who you are." And I said, "Well, okay, thanks. Let me just give you a piece of literature here." And my son's running for office. He goes, "You know what?" He says, "I never voted for you once when you were in office, and I'm probably not going to vote for your son either." I says, "All right, thank you. We'll put you down as a maybe." But in any event, I tend to see the optimistic point of view on these things. I admit to it. But Bob, you seem to have kind of a pessimistic view of this, which I actually understand on this one. But if you would tell us about your article and what you saw.
Post-World War II, the United States has been, in actuality and in perception, the leader of what's commonly known as the free world. And that's countries that share our basic values of having a government that protects and respects individual liberties and democratic governance. We didn't make that the only consideration in our foreign policy. We had a realpolitik view, particularly during the Cold War. We did support and assist autocrats that were anti-communist and anti the Soviet Union. But generally, that was the lodestar, and we accepted the role and were perceived to have the role. I think in just a month, Trump has effectively abdicated that role for good or ill. And the Ukraine situation, I think, is much of an illustration. Ukraine aspires to join that free world. It wants to be fully integrated into a democratic Europe. And Putin went to war to prevent that from happening. Putin initially wanted to destroy the existing democratically elected Ukrainian government, impose a puppet regime, and turn it into a vassal state. The Ukrainians, with what they had, and without U.S. or Western European support at the time, repelled that invasion. Putin remobilized into the east and then began a very slow movement to try to complete the annexation that he's proclaimed of the eastern provinces. Putin will not accept what the Ukrainians want for themselves and their future, which is to join the free world. And Trump, he would be willing to accept a vassal state and a demilitarized Ukraine that can't defend itself, and a government which is subservient to Russia. And it appears crystal clear that Trump is prepared to try to cram that kind of a peace, although that's a misnomer, settlement on Ukraine. And I think that is as much of an abdication, where you've got presented as nakedly and plainly as possible a country that aspires to join the free world and a autocrat that wants to suppress and will not accept that outcome. When you side with the autocrat in that circumstance, and he did it openly in the UN vote. I think that's clearly what he was headed towards before this blow up. you've abdicated the leadership. And that's not the only factor. I mean, he's threatened military action against Panama, a democratically elected government. He's over the canal. He's threatened military action against Denmark over Greenland. His Secretary of Defense has talked about a military incursion into Mexico. I've racked my brain to think if there were any other examples in the post World War II period in which a U.S. president has threatened military action against a democratic country. And I can't think of any. And then you compound that with what he's done to Mexico and Canada on the issue of trade. He negotiated a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. And he has threatened to violate it with his tariffs. He may tomorrow actually violate it. And if he's unwilling to honor his own commitments, why in the world would any other country believe that he would honor commitments that have been made by past American presidents and that this country has stood for? And an awful lot of the current security architecture around the world is based upon a belief that the United States will honor its commitments. And I think with Donald Trump, that is no longer a safe assumption. And I think other democratic countries in the free world are reaching that conclusion, and we're going to see a geopolitical realignment as a result of it.
All right, we're going to parse all of that apart as we go through this, but let's first see if we have agreement or disagreement on the primary question. We'll start with you, Professor Thompson, on the idea of America is really no longer the leader of the free world. Of course, that doesn't mean that we still don't have a massive amount of economic strength, and for that matter, maybe political strength. But you're someone who spent a lot of time talking to and listening to leaders around the world. What's your view of that? How do you see that?
Well, I think that it's a complicated picture of American leadership in the global economy, in the global international security system. And a lot of this is more structural than any one American president. So just for example, we're seeing already the problems of the NATO alliance and trying to come up with a security guarantee for Ukraine without US leadership. They illustrate perfectly America's military predominance, regardless of who's in the White House. The United States spends more on defense than pretty much the entire rest of the world combined. It's probably the only country in the world that has any real force projection on an intercontinental scale. And so there are certain things about American military power and influence that won't change regardless of who's in the White House, at least in the short to medium run. You could say the same thing about the global economy. The position of the US dollar has only really strengthened over the last few years as the global reserve currency. That's not going away quickly anytime soon. The United States still remains the biggest, most dynamic economy in the world. In fact, that position seems to be growing. And those things aren't going to change regardless of who's in the White House. So although Bob might be right that America's standing, especially with many of the more liberal-minded democratic governments in the world, may have suffered, there are certain realities about American power in the international system that won't change and that other countries are going to have to come to terms with. And we're seeing that in the way that the Ukrainian conflict is being dealt with. So yes, is there going to be increasing skepticism of how durable America's policy positions on any given area are? Yes, there is already a lot of skepticism on those issues. It's only going to grow under Trump. But in terms of leadership, there is no other country in the world that can provide the sort of leadership that the United States can. And so regardless of who's in the White House, other countries are going to have to come to terms with American power and American influence. It could be that they do it in a different way in the post-Trump era. That could certainly be true. But countries are always going to have to reckon with the United States and American political and economic power, regardless of who is in the White House.
Yeah, I believe Bob's read of the situation is certainly possible. I have a slightly different read, more optimistic, in that Trump is a strange boy, and there's no two ways around that. That being said, he believes in a world where they shouldn't depend on America. He sees the rest of the world as spoiled children who basically don't want to work, basically because daddy will take care of them. Well, he doesn't want daddy to take care of him anymore. He wants daddy wants basically what's best for the whole family, not for these particular kids. So what he's saying is, you know what? You got to pay for your own defense, or at least a lot more of it. Don't depend on us for everything. We're going to do things that like we haven't done since World War II, because things have changed since World War II. And whether they have or not is a different story, but he believes they have. And he doesn't want the U.S. to bear all the burdens in terms of trade deficits, in terms of paying for things that they've borne before. So what does he do? He comes up with, on the face of it, strange solutions. And here's where I'm more optimistic than Bob. I believe his argument about, okay, we're going to basically get everybody out of the Gaza Strip and put up a bunch of hotels. Anybody who takes that seriously is on drugs. I mean, it basically, but it did force the Arab countries to start talking about things. What has happened since the episode with Zelensky, which I think was deplorable on a lot of levels, is that Europe is actually starting to get together and talking. What are we going to do? We're going to have to do things so America is not going to be our full protection. We got to protect ourselves, and we have to have essentially a backup. What did Trump want to do? He wanted to have basically the agreement to get these minerals out of the Ukraine country, and ultimately that would cause tens of billions of dollars of investment by American companies in Ukraine. And that in itself should be enough security guarantee, because the U.S. is not going to let Russia walk in and take that. Although Biden obviously walked into let the bad guys in Afghanistan take a lot of American goods unnecessarily. But they are now trying to minimize the guarantees of the U.S. so the U.S. feels more comfortable. Is that good or bad? I don't know. All I know is it's different, and it's the way the world's going to have to look at it for at least the next 4 years, if not the next 8 or 12, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And I don't have a problem with the basic concept of we should not be paying for everybody else's protection, but we've got to structure something so that the bad guys can't automatically fill that vacuum, which to me is the biggest risk.
All right. So, Bob, I'm going to come back to you on this question. I'm going to try to parse this apart into several different pieces. I'm going to start with what's the purpose here? Why did this event happen in the White House? And one thought of it is that Trump's just impulsive. We remember in the debate that he had with Kamala Harris, you could just watch him. Kamala put out the bait and talking about what he was going to do in terms of pardoning bad guys, and he just bit right into it. He couldn't help it. And so maybe there was a matter of impulse here. But, I've been following Vance's speeches for a long time, even longer than the period of time that he was vice president. To me, there seems to be a new politics that is evolving. And by the way, I think it exists on the far right and the far left. It is a politics of pessimism. If you listen to Vance, his point of view isn't all that much different than Russia or China, in that he believes that the United States has lost power, that we don't have the economic might that we once had. Even if you read his book, Hillbilly Effigy, it is a book that is steeped with the idea that America is a declining power, the problems that are being created, the people who are being ignored. It is a very, very pessimistic view about who it is that we are. And with that pessimistic view, you start to say, well, maybe we need to make certain that we're backing up and that we're not providing the defense for Europe, we're not providing the defense for the rest of the world, and we're not providing that strategic guarantee. Now, I personally think, and looking at the data, that's a wrong point of view. In fact, I would argue that the United States, which makes up 5% of the world's economy and 25% of the world's wealth, China's economy is floundering. Russia, in my opinion, has bit off a much bigger piece than they could actually chew. They haven't done nearly as well. They've lost somewhere 1 million men in both deaths, casualties, and people who were wounded taken off the battlefield. Iran has been set back in the Middle East. I think this could potentially be a golden period for the United States. But if you have a pessimistic view, you're going to take a different approach. What's your thought on this? Was there a strategic move? Again, when I watched Vance, he seemed to be the instigator in the problem on this in the beginning. And that just seemed to me to fall in line with what I believe his view has been. Your thoughts?
I don't believe that what occurred in the Oval Office was pre-planned or that Vance intended for the result that obtained. However, I think it's nevertheless instructive. It began with a diatribe that Vance initiated about how awful the Biden administration approach to the situation was and how Trump was going to come in and rescue everything by engaging in diplomacy with Putin. Zelensky then reasonably started pointing out all the instances in which Putin has not honored his commitment. And that is when Vance made the explosive charge, you're being disrespectful. But what he really meant is that you're not being sufficiently obsequious to Trump as president and placing your entire fate in his hands when he has clearly decided to side with Putin in rendering Ukraine a vassal state and thwarting their ambition to join the free world. If you have a pessimistic view of America, the way that you described, Paul, I don't how you reach the conclusion that therefore the United States should engage in great power political imperial dealings in this particular situation. To me, what you say is, and there can be a reasonable discussion about the extent to which the United States should be financially supporting the Ukrainians. That's a reasonable public policy argument. He's been on the side from the beginning of not giving them anything, just letting them fend for themselves. But that can be a reasonable argument. But that's not what's happening. We're not saying we're not going to participate. We're saying we're going to participate and we're going to try to arrange things so Putin wins. I don't know how that squares with any notion of any view of the role of the United States in the world. It's a revision back to 19th century great power politics, where the great powers decided things and the small countries just had to accept them. That is the unifying theme. I don't think that Trump has any strategic overview or paradigm. But the concatenation of his impulsive efforts are all great power imperial politics. We're going to decide things with Putin over Ukraine. Europeans don't even get a seat at the table. We're going to get the canal back from Panama, even though there was a treaty approved by the Congress. That's the supreme law of the land that gave it to Panama. And if necessary, we're going to invade Greenland, even though Denmark owns it and it's a democratic NATO ally. I don't know how you make sense of this at all, except as fairly naked great power politics which isn't what you would expect people who are concerned about the United States being a declining power and needing to spend more attention to domestic affairs, how that can be a reasonable conclusion. It's not an America First effort. America First would be, let's stay out of it, not side with Putin.
Elliott, you look at numbers all the time. First, I'd like, certainly you can comment on what Bob has said, but I'd like to just know from your standpoint, do you see the U.S. as a declining power as in comparison to places like China, Russia, Iran, that they're emerging powers and that we're declining? Do you see it more optimistically where the United States is in a position where maybe we could have a much greater role than what we've attributed to ourselves?
Today or 2 months ago?
Today.
Today, no. Today, I see it restructuring itself to make it more about open markets and individual decisions. I didn't see that 2 months ago. I saw just the opposite. We're from the government. We're here to help you. And that is, we were going down a democratic socialism like Europe, and we'd end up the same way Europe did, in the garbage can, because their economies are all crap, quite frankly, including the miracle of Germany, just like the miracle of Japan. Somehow it didn't pan out that way. And it all is about the way you structure yourself. Europe has fallen apart because they become it's not a liberal democracy, it's a socialist democracy. And things are decided not by people voting their money and deciding what they want, but by some bureaucrat in the little hole in the wall who wasn't elected, and can't be fired especially if he's French, basically deciding what the free market should decide. That's, to me, that structure in the U.S. appears to be changing. But will the U.S. Am I worried about China? China is going the same way of Russia. It might take 20 years longer, but Russia, as the whole world now knows, it would be like us invading Puerto Rico and losing. I mean, it's just ridiculous. They've lost half their tanks. They've lost more than 1 million people. They have to depend on North Korea for soldiers. This is a country that won't exist as we now know it 10 or 20 years from now. And I think the same thing is true with China. And especially China, where everything is backdoor and underground, and their motives are just plain crooked. I don't know how else to put it. Who else is there? There is nobody else. And does that mean the world's going to be cut into thirds, where the U.S. dominates one, China dominates another, and Russia dominates another? Russia, quite frankly, when I was a kid, we'd say he can't punch his way out of a paper bag. That's the way Russia has come across since they invaded the Ukraine. China is a threat because they are spending so much money on technology. That scares me somewhat, but they don't have the manpower. They won't have the manpower 10 or 20 years from now than they do now. And the only thing I can say is, Mao, how's that one child per family policy working for you now? So no, the U.S. is not on the decline economically. It would have been a slower growth economy. It would have been slowed to the rates of growth that Europe is seeing. But I don't believe that is the case now. The more that individuals make decisions and not government makes decisions, the stronger an economy is going to be.
I can agree with that. All right, Professor Thompson, in terms of, you were making comments a moment ago that the strength of the United States still puts us into a position where people are going to have to reckon with us. If you look at this long term and you take our trajectory and what's going on with other countries around the world, are you optimistic about the long-term view of the U.S., or do you think that we should be hunkering down and beginning to focus more on local problems that have been ignored?
I think that the United States is in a far stronger position than any other major developed economy, including China, India, and obviously including Russia. everything that Elliott said about the United States' strengths is true. Everything that he said about a move away from statism towards more free markets is true. This is going to strengthen the American economy going forward. America is going to be the predominant power for the foreseeable future, economically and militarily, in the world. But what Bob said is also partially true, meaning that doesn't mean that America's political elites and that American voters view America as such. And it certainly doesn't mean that they take an expansive view of what American power should do. The way I interpret Trump is he's comfortable with American power. He understands the nature of American power in the world, but he understands it, as Bob said, in these very simple, realist terms. And he understands, or he wants, payoffs to come immediately. The system that Bob described, the so-called liberal international order that was set up after World War II by the United States, had the United States at the center of it. The United States was the predominant power in NATO, in the International Monetary Fund, in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The United States controlled all of these institutions to a large extent, and the institutions benefited all the Western states, but they benefited America more, or at least as much as any other player in the system. The United States was the hegemon, but there was a rising tide that lifted all boats. Donald Trump does not see American power in that institutionalized, expansive way. He wants to see the United States in bilateral agreements getting gains immediately, even at the expense of allies and trading partners. He wants to see those benefits come immediately. I think that is reconcilable with growing and expanding American power. I think you can have an expanding, powerful United States under the leadership of a president who wants to use that power in a bilateral way, in a nationalist, isolationist way, to get results immediately, rather than building or using institutions in a durable way to set things up in a way that benefits the United States and its allies in a diffuse way long term. So I think the United States is going to be a very powerful but growing, increasingly isolationist power as we move forward over the next decades.
All right. So, Henry, I'm going to stick with you on this question, mainly because at least one of our friends made a comment this week, H.R. McMaster's, where he talked about Trump was being overly influenced, and I'm paraphrasing this in my way. You should listen to his comments on your own if you want to listen to Goodfellas. But nonetheless, that Trump was being unduly influenced by Putin. Here's the point that I would make. I'm watching this, and what I sense is that there is an agenda at play. You just spoke about us becoming increasingly more isolated. That theoretically, Bob made a good point that if that's what you were trying to do, you can't understand it in the context of what we're doing with Greenland and other areas. But J.D. Vance has it kind of an America first point of view. And if you again listen to his speeches, that's what you'll hear. When he went and spoke in Munich, he talked about how Europe was a bigger threat to the United States than Russia, which was a little bit off-putting to many people who were Americans. I also noticed he got into a fight with Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson's a very conservative historian who wrote basically an article saying, hey, if you want to go through peace through strength, you ought to try and put strength forward first and then try to push that or utilize that to try to get to peace. And he was offended by that and kind of attacked Neil Ferguson. I also noticed in the meeting that he was the first one to go after Zelensky. Now, I agree with Bob. I don't think it was pre-planned, but I think that Vance, in many ways, in my opinion, is a Dick Cheney type figure. He has an idea of the world that he wants to create, and he is pushing for that from the sideline. Effectively, his position by attacking Zelensky, why would you attack him? I can give you the answer to that politically. I don't know what the right answer to that is strategically, but I can give it to you politically, because he's in the way. There are a lot of Americans that like Zelensky. There are a lot of Americans that like the idea that he stood up and said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. There are a lot of Americans who would like to think about Americans being like that, American presidents being like that. And we're not so sure that we've had any in the last four. In fact, most of the last four, I think all four of them actually made mistakes with Putin. When you look back on it, it was George Bush who said, I looked into his eyes and it looked to me like he was telling the truth. And we saw that from Obama. We certainly saw that from Biden. The point that I'm getting to here is Zelensky is a popular figure, and he actually was somewhat popular on the right. He needs to get rid of him. And the best way to get rid of him, by the way, you don't need to get rid of him in general public opinion. You just need to make certain you've locked down the Republican side. And you knock down the Republican side or lock it down by saying, you were disrespectful to the president. You campaigned against the president. You put it in very political terms so your people will hate them. Because if you get to that, you're going to have a more successful congressional agenda. So my question back to you, it seems to me that a lot of what was happening in that meeting actually was being driven by a political agenda, and that there's a lot of partisan politics taking place here to try to promote a strategy that really most of us aren't focused on. Your thoughts?
I agree. This is about partisan American politics. And I think Zelensky misread the situation that he was walking into. I think the Europeans still don't understand Donald Trump and what has happened in the United States since he was elected in 2016, particularly within the Republican Party. And so I think that J.D. Vance especially was playing to the Republican base in that meeting. He was playing to essentially his future constituency because he has a future in electoral politics. I assume he wants to run for president. He's going to have to win Republican primaries. And that was who he was appealing to in that meeting. I don't think that Zelensky understood that that was the audience. I still don't think the Europeans have understood what's going on. Maybe the British understand it a little better. Keir Starmer had a relatively good meeting with Trump, it seems, last week and seems to be trying to navigate this. But I viewed that meeting through the lens of American domestic politics, not really through a strategic lens of international politics at the end of the day.
Bob, I'd like your thoughts on that. Plus, I want to ask you while I'm doing this, before the show, you were giving me the one optimistic point of view that I've heard from you on this in terms of the role that...
He's talking about the last several years, Bob. He's not talking about
last decades. In fact, he was never optimistic while I was mayor, but that might have been because I was mayor.
I would agree that Vance is almost always playing domestic politics in of a highly destructive and unhelpful way. My source of optimism is twofold. I do think that there has been an awakening in Europe, and I'm more optimistic, I think, of the extent to which European leaders understand where they now stand with respect to the United States, which is largely alone, and are at least talking about trying to do something about that. And while there are military capabilities that Europe is not in a position to replicate that the United States can provide, I think Trump was going to pull the rug out from under Ukraine regardless. I think that there was going to be an end to U.S. continued assistance to Ukraine irrespective. So I really don't think Zelensky had anything to lose in that meeting. I think it was already gone. But if the Europeans can organize sufficiently to keep Ukraine in the fight, I think people are misreading, and Trump dramatically misreading, where the configuration of forces lie. And I think I go back to what happened in this war to begin with. Which was Putin amassed what appeared to be overwhelming force. The entire world thought that he would be taking over all of Ukraine in a matter of days. and the Ukrainians, with what they had at that time, repelled that invasion. And it wasn't until they successfully did that that the United States and Western Europe began to provide assistance. They are fighting for their liberty, their sovereignty, and their future. And those that are fighting for Russia are fighting out of fear that their superiors will shoot them in the back if they don't fight. And I think that is a strategic advantage that is being very badly underestimated when when there's a discussion of what happens if the United States abandons Ukraine, which I think Trump was going to do irrespective of how this meeting occurred or how anything else occurred.
All right, Elliott, the question I'm going to start with you on this is, does Vladimir Putin want peace? And here's the point that I would try to make. The other day in this meeting, there was a lot of blame being put on Zelensky for not wanting peace, for potentially being the cause of World War III, pointing out that they don't have any cards, which seemed to me what they were really asking Zelensky for was an unconditional peace agreement. And that means surrender. I mean, that really is what, to me, that means. But the bigger question, instead of whether or not Zelensky wants peace, is does Putin want peace? And that question for me comes down to, he's lost 1 million men. Was he really willing to lose 1 million men to keep the line exactly where it was beforehand? I think he has bigger ambitions. I haven't seen anything from Putin that says that he is going to be willing to allow Europeans to be peacekeepers, for us to give additional resources to Zelensky, for there to be any way for them to be self-sustainable. To me, he's looking for them to be a vassal state. But do you see that differently? Do you think that Putin himself actually would like to accomplish peace? Maybe your view is he's just tired and worn out, and this is the right time for him to compromise. How do you see it?
I don't know, but I do know this, that if he ends up not coming away with something, I don't know how he maintains his power base. I think he's a goner. He might be a goner either way, but he certainly is going to be a goner unless he can say, look what I accomplished. And does that mean, as Bob is saying, that all of Ukraine goes? No, I think Ukraine is likely to be restructured. And the more American interests there are in Ukraine, the better for Ukraine. But will it go back to the borders pre-Putin? Not as long as Putin's there. He has no choice. He's pot committed, as they say in poker. He is pot committed. He's not going to settle for something that he can't claim as victorious. Now, what he can get away with claiming as victorious and what's really victorious are probably two different things. What Trump has to do is come up with something that makes Zelensky understand that it's not going to be back to pre-borders, pre-invasion borders, and they make Putin understand, well, you can make this seem like a victory. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But I think that it's still in flux. I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out, but I will tell you that they're not going back to pre-invasion borders, but they're not going to, I don't think, provide the type of guarantees that Ukraine wants and, quite frankly, deserves. I watched that meeting several times, and the best comment I read on that meeting in the White House last week was the New York Times the next day, or New York Times, the Wall Street Journal the next day. They basically said all that Vance has proved is he's not ready for prime time. What he did was deplorable and stupid. He's the one who basically really threw the gasoline on the fire, as far as I'm concerned. And I was shocked and disappointed. I don't know how else to put it. Zelensky should have negotiated these things. He should have talked to Trump before they went into a public meeting with a bunch of reporters. I don't understand how they allowed this to happen. It's mind-boggling to me that they put themselves in that situation and that they let Vance talk. I mean, most of the time Harris was told to keep her mouth shut. Well, obviously, it's time to tell that to Vance, because without his instigation, Trump wouldn't have bitten as he did on Zelensky's anger at the situation. And it's very unfortunate. But is this going to come out clean and are both sides going to be happy? Not a chance in the world. But, exactly how it plays out, I don't know.
All right, Henry, your thoughts on this. Is Putin actually ready for peace? And, Elliott's point, which I think is a good point, is, look, you're not going to get there unless you're willing to give him some thought of victory. But my read of it is that, and maybe I have a more cynical view of Putin. My view of Putin is he's not going to agree to anything except for full capitulation by Ukraine. He wants them to be a vassal state of Russia, and in the end, he wants to control it. He doesn't want Europe having their hands in it. He doesn't want the United States having his hands in it. And I think his view is, sure, he'll negotiate with Trump right up until the point that it becomes clear that Trump and this administration is not going to give them more weapons. And once that happens, it begins to break the spirit of the fighting guy in Ukraine who's down in those trenches today, wondering why he's going to continue. Now, I'm hoping Bob's optimism is right, that maybe what happens is, well, what should happen? Europe should step up. By the way, I think that's one of the good things that could come out of this, which is Trump actually forcing the Europeans to start paying for part of their defense. I just think that we ought to do that in a way in which we're allies with them as opposed to enemies with them. But do you believe that Putin maybe is at that breaking point where he's ready now to look for some type of reasonable type of peace agreement?
Well, I think it's important to note that the reason why these negotiations are taking a different turn is not because of Russian weakness, but because of the American election and the consequences that that's had for the conflict and for Ukraine's standing. So I don't think that Putin's position has changed. And in fact, the battlefield situation over the last year or year and a half has only really turned in the Russians' favor. So I don't think this is a case that Putin is being forced to the negotiating table. He could continue this conflict, I think, for quite a long time. They have a very sophisticated propaganda apparatus in Russia that is portraying this conflict already as being a victory for Russia. And there's almost no opposition to Putin within the Russian regime, and certainly not in the Russian population at large. There's no opposition party in Russia. There's no opposition movement to speak of. There's no independent trade union movement like we saw in Poland during the communist era, anything like that. So Putin is in a relatively secure position, and his position on the battlefield seems relatively strong. What's changed is the American willingness to support Ukraine in this fight with weaponry and funds, as expressed through Trump and his changed position towards Zelensky. So the question of whether Putin is willing to abide by a ceasefire and what he really wants is a very, very difficult one, and can only really be tested in practice. But based on past experience, Putin doesn't really seem to like these conflicts in his near abroad to end. He's had running conflicts in Georgia and in close parts of Georgia that are sort of breakaway regions. He's quite comfortable to have these breakaway regions of neighboring states that are Russian aligned, that he maintains relationships with to keep conflict simmering on Russia's borders. And there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't be happy to keep a conflict simmering in Ukraine as well for the indefinite future. I'm a little more dubious about an attempt to take the entire country militarily. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen. I'm just saying that it seems like a stretch given Russia's military capabilities, the way that they are now. And I'm not sure whether the governance problems for an invading force, given the new, very strong Ukrainian nationalism, I don't know how Russia could hold the western portion of Ukraine if there was sustained guerrilla and partisan warfare against Russian forces there. So I'm a little bit more dubious of the notion that Putin would want to roll all the way west through the Ukraine to the Polish border. But I do think that he wants to hold the territory that he has now, that he maybe wants to hold territory even further west, the entire eastern sort of third of Ukraine, and that he's quite comfortable with a conflict that simmers away with significant fighting along a sort of a line of conflict between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. I think he would be happy for that to continue for the indefinite future. So I think even a proper ceasefire where there's no actual shooting and killing in eastern Ukraine is going to be very difficult to achieve. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays itself out.
Bob, on the issue of what Putin really wants, H.R. McMaster's made a comment the other day, again, part of what caused him a problem with Trump. He was talking about how you create peace through strength. And he said, look, the way that you get to peace through strength is you increase the funding that and by the way, again, I'm paraphrasing my view of what I saw. I encourage people to watch Goodfellas. But my view was, he was saying, look, what you start by doing is you increase funding that you're going to give the Ukrainians, you increase sanctions, and then you come back and say, we want a peace agreement. So I'm going to ask you two questions. The first one is, do you think that there's any real desire for Putin for peace? My view of this is, at the end of the day, he didn't lose 1 million troops to even keep the lines close to where they were. He has a much bigger ambitions, and if he exits this with the sense of a victory, he'll be back. But the second question I think that is just as important is, part of how we've been able to keep this American world order that we talk about has been through deterrence. And interestingly enough, it's been deterrence on all sides against one another. I mean, I don't have any doubt about this. We might have entered into a nuclear war earlier if we didn't have opponents that could have done the same thing back to us. But that's how deterrence works. It works in that they're afraid that we'll take the next step. I'm worried that we're giving so much up right up front that it is presenting a view of American weakness. Your thought on those two questions?
Well, Zelensky has indicated a willingness to accept in a peace deal some territorial concessions in exchange for having a free path forward for the rest of Ukraine to become fully integrated with democratic Europe. That is precisely the outcome that Putin went to war to prevent. I think Putin would accept temporarily some kind of a ceasefire if the rest of Ukraine became a sovereign state in name only and was demilitarized and basically defenseless and not able to join European institutions, including the European Union. I think he would accept a peace agreement that yielded that result, and I think Trump is willing to try to achieve that for him. And certainly, if you before the election, the thought was that, or at least what was being leaked by the Trump campaign, was that he was going to do what you described. He was going to threaten Putin with increased aid to Ukraine, and he was going to threaten Ukraine with cutting off aid if they didn't enter into a peace agreement. I don't think. I think that was a misrepresentation of what was going to happen under the Trump administration. I think cutting off Ukraine was going to occur irrespective. The most revealing and disturbing part of the episode with Zelensky in the Oval Office to me was Trump describing he and Putin as brothers in arms for what they had endured as a result of the Mueller investigation, and that Putin was his soulmate, and how much both of them were unfairly subjected during that period. Well, I agreed from the beginning that saying that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia's attempted interference in the 2016 election was a witch hunt. There just wasn't any evidence there. But there is zero doubt that Russia in 2016 engaged in the most aggressive subversion campaign in the post-Cold War period. Which included trying to breach the voter registration files in all 50 states, and they succeeded in a state or two. Our belief is that all they did was to extract personal data from those files, that they didn't alter them in any way. But there was a multi-part campaign, and Trump expressed the view that Putin was his soulmate in that unfair investigation. I think that was very revealing and deeply disturbing.
Yeah, H.R. McMaster's made the point again, and I think this was the part that really got Trump's ire. He spoke about what he believed Vladimir Putin would have said to Trump on the phone, which would have, he said more importantly, that the way that he would have tried to influence Trump would have been by talking about how, one, they want peace, how the rest of the world has abused the United States, how NATO has abused the United States, how oftentimes Trump has been abused, that he helped him buy into that victim attitude. And I wondered the same thing when I heard that comment, which was, well, there's an interesting linkage to the trauma that he believed that he suffered. And as it turns out, in the end, you were right. He was, and by the way, I wasn't there in the beginning. I was definitely worried about Trump potentially working with Putin. That just turned out to be wrong. But what didn't turn out to be wrong was Vladimir Putin was trying to interfere in our elections. Elliott, here's the question. I'll start with you, which is, what effect do you think this begins to have on Europe? And this is my thought. You can tell me if you disagree with it or not. My thought is that Europe is going to do as Bob said. They're going to start trying to put together a European defense. I think they're going to have to. That's not such a bad thing. The downside will be that Europe is going to be more highly armed. And in addition to that, I think they're going to look for a nuclear deterrence to Russia. A nuclear deterrence that's probably going to have to be provided by France and by England, but it could be a nuclear proliferation issue that begins to expand into other countries like Poland. I also think that they're not going to be far off of looking at areas where maybe they no longer need to be strategically allied with the United States. We've spoken on past shows about why would Europe have the same incentive to be a supporter of Israel if they don't feel like they need to appease the United States. In fact, they need oil. And in needing oil, they're probably going to align more with the Arab states. And in addition to that, I think they might ask the question, why do they need to be involved in or engaged in the same battle that we're having with China and Taiwan? Maybe from their standpoint, gaining support from China might make sense. In fact, there was discussion about actually Chinese troops being there, and Xi wasn't dismissive of the idea. It's not lost on me what he'd want for that. He'd want a trade agreement where he could sell his goods into Europe to be able to do it. I think he'd turn his back on Russia in a minute. Maybe not, but that's kind of my thought. Point I guess I'm giving is this ends up being potentially a very, very big change to the world order.
Well, from what I've read, and Henry probably has a better idea if this is true or not, places like Germany are so much into welfare benefits that for them, at the rate of growth they have now, to substantially increase defense spending would mean cuts in welfare benefits that, quite frankly, politically might not be tenable, might not be doable, and you'll end up with a leftist government. And so I'm not sure how far they can go in terms of defending themselves. I think it's going to take a long time. And therefore, if they had a deterrent, a nuclear deterrent, again, either from France or from England, that would get them there sooner. But these type of changes are dangerous. The last time we had this type of change, there was only one superpower left standing, and that was the U.S. We haven't had something like this, I don't know, maybe since the American Revolution. Henry, you can comment on that. That worries me. What you just said worries me a lot. I'm hoping that this causes Europe to rethink what they've become and the direction in which they're headed. I think that even as strange as some decisions coming out of Europe have been, to align themselves with China is, China's they're a grifter. They're basically, what can we get from you? We'll make you feel good, but basically we're going to get more from you than you get from us. That's the way they've always played it. That's the nature of what they are doing. I hopefully that doesn't happen, but I think that this is going to force Europe to rethink a lot of things. But are they going to walk away from the U.S. towards China? I would be doubtful. Would they walk away from supporting Israel? They'd do that in a heartbeat because of the nature of their populations. Israel's on its own, and except for us, I believe that's been the case for 1948, and I still believe that's.
Yeah, it's such an interesting and important question, the knock-on effects of these events and the Ukraine war for European politics, for the transatlantic alliance, and then also, honestly, for the sort of the global security landscape as well. I've been going back and forth about this. I'm relatively alarmed about a rearming Europe, especially nuclear armament by Germany and other large European states that don't have nuclear weapons. I am also alarmed at the thought of these big European industrial economies starting to really develop their national militaries with heavy equipment and heavy weaponry that they have sort of not invested in for a long time. But then when I think about it in the more long run, and I think about the real political priorities of European countries, maybe they don't want to spend the money on defense. Maybe it's easier for them to simply reach some new grand bargain with the United States and the Trump administration, where they agree to spend a certain amount more money on defense and play a slightly larger role, especially in Europe's near abroad, in the NATO states on the eastern border, maybe peacekeepers in Ukraine, etc. But they can keep their defense spending at a level that is manageable and that they can continue their other priorities, especially their welfare states, their generous worker training programs, basically the pillars of their political economy, because it would be extremely disruptive for them to try and really change and move away from their sort of more statist social market economies. So it could be that after this initial shock, they realize what the real costs would be and how difficult it would be to rearm in a real way, and they come back to some sort of negotiation and some sort of new deal with the United States and Canada and the other NATO allies. And that allows the United States to do what it's wanted to do for the last 15 years, which is to try and focus on balancing Chinese power in the Western Pacific. And that, I think, would be a good deal if the Europeans would commit to meeting a slightly higher NATO target and more intense training and et cetera, a different division of labor in European security that would free up resources for the US to pivot to China and the Pacific. I think that would be a good outcome, especially if it also resulted in isolating Russia and in isolating Putin and not rewarding him for his invasion of Ukraine. So, yes, I'm alarmed at the knock-on effects of this for Europe, but the more I think about it and how difficult it would be for the Europeans to really raise that military force on their own, I think maybe there might be some sort of a new grand bargain for the transatlantic alliance that could work out to everybody's benefit.
Yeah, my own personal belief on this is you can't get to peace on your knees. There's little doubt in my mind that Putin is going to be much more ambitious and aggressive if he's allowed to be, if he sees the opening. The point that's been made is he has 170 battalions. If he wins in Ukraine, he has 300 battalions. Every time you take over a new territory, you gain an industrial base, you gain a tax base, and you also gain a group of people that you can conscript into your military. As that power grows, I don't think he's going to become less ambitious. I think he's going to become more ambitious. The reason to provide for a deterrence, in my mind, even if it means a European force, is simply because you can't risk that. You just can't risk them having that. Bob, your thoughts on changes that may happen in Europe because of what's taken place today? Your article, we'll come back to your article here in the end, was the U.S. is no longer the leader of the free world. So what do you think Europe does?
I think it's going to be a combination of things. Relying on sort of a refurbished, re-energized, restructured NATO security guarantee would require confidence that Trump was committed to the collective security that's envisioned by NATO. And I think the confidence of European leaders in that has been shaken, and I think appropriately so. His administration is already making plans for significant reductions in U.S. forces stationed in Europe, including withdrawing troops from sort of the front line across the border from Russia. The Europeans don't have a mechanism for collective defense and collective defense decision making outside of NATO. So it is something that doesn't currently exist. And given the nature of Europe, a whole bunch of relatively small countries by our measure, it will be difficult to cobble that together. I think the approach with Ukraine of creating coalitions of the willing is a positive sign and might have some degree of success. But I suspect the reaction in Europe will be a combination of trying to develop some degree of additional domestic defense capabilities, some ability to keep Ukraine in the fight. But also, I suspect there's going to be accommodation made both in Europe and the Indo-Pacific to the currently, and I agree with Elliott's analysis, these are declining economic powers, both Russia and China, but they're strong military powers in the region at present. And I think that there will be more of an accommodation. If the United States is willing to consider being dependent upon Russia for critical minerals, what's the basis for Europe to continue to be unwilling to accept natural gas from Russia? I think you'll see a similar, more of an accommodating attitude in the Indo-Pacific. I don't think Taiwan has any reason to believe that Trump will be any more fervent in defending it than he's proven to be in defending Ukraine. We have explicit security guarantees with Japan that I don't think Japan can rely upon. So I think you'll have a combination to be worked out, and I don't know in what degree it will be, increasing defense capabilities independent of the United States, while also trying to create some kind of better understanding with the regional autocratic military powers.
All right. This is the last question. It's a bonus question because I'm going to change the subject just a little bit. We've all been following DOGE. We've all been following the federal budget. Elliott and I are the two supporters on here of DOGE. That doesn't mean that others aren't supportive of the concept of trying to get to a budget that is back down in terms of being closer to balanced or at the deficit being at 3% of the GDP as opposed to 7%. I'm not necessarily in agreement with DOGE on all of its tactics, but I'm in definite agreement with DOGE on the concept. Elliott, this week, the House passed a budget which added about $360 billion back on top of the Biden budget, at least as best I can read or understand the budget. That would seem to me to wipe out what DOGE is doing. So the question that really I'm asking is this, and I'm just going to ask all of us in turn. What chance do you think that we have right now of getting this budget down to being somewhere within the realm of what this administration has targeted, the deficit being within 3% of GDP within the next 12 to 24 months?
Me, I would basically give it 1 and 4. And then the question becomes whether or not the numbers are real. No, these are all based on projections that are vetted, but they tend to miss a lot more than they tend to be right on, spot on. So I think they have to do something. As Bob has pointed out before, the numbers make no sense. It seems like an equivocation of what he's saying. My take on it is that there's going to be enough bluster coming out of the Senate that they're going to have to come up with a budget that, at least on the face of it, looks like it's moving in the right direction.
There's no more critical effort for America's future than fixing the finances of the federal government. But I think DOGE is irrelevant to that task. They're trying right now to develop a reduction in force. Well, the federal government isn't a labor-intensive enterprise. If they could reduce the federal payroll by a third, which is triple their current ambition, it would save $100 billion a year. So the federal deficit would be reduced from 1.9 trillion to 1.8 trillion. It wouldn't fundamentally address what's wrong and what needs to be fixed in the federal government's finances. And you have the budget resolution that came out of the House, which called for $1.5 trillion in spending reductions over 10 years. That's an average of $150 billion a year. That's also not going to make a material difference. So I would say that the chances of anything happening in the next 12 to 24 months to meaningfully fix the finances of the federal government are next to zero, unless there is some kind of reaction in the bond market that can not be ignored. And I think you will continue to see, I think you're beginning to see a risk premium on federal debt instruments. I don't think that will go away. It might actually increase, but I don't think enough to make the politicians make the truly tough decisions, which isn't firing a whole bunch of probationary workers.
I'm going to give them a 1 in 10 chance because, you never know what would happen, but I don't think that balancing the federal government is really Donald Trump's priority. Donald Trump wants to cut taxes on Social Security and on tips. He wants to maintain all current federal spending programs with regards to healthcare and pensions, Social Security. And so I really don't think that there's any scope for meaningfully cutting the federal budget because those are the big ticket items. So I don't think Trump wants to do it. So I don't think that it's going to happen. He could change his mind. Something like the markets could force him to change his mind. Any of these things are possible, but I don't think that it's very probable that that will happen.
All right. So Elliott wins the bonus round because on the bonus round, I would have said 1 in 2 chances. He said 1 in 4, and he's definitely the closest to mine. My reason for being 1 in 2 actually is because of Elon Musk. I think the benefit of Elon Musk being here is I actually think he is emotionally bought into the cuts working. He said in the staff meeting, which has gotten a lot of attention the other week, that he wants to show up at the next budget reconciliation. I can't imagine what a great train wreck that one's going to be, but nonetheless, his being bought into it gives me actually more hope. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll talk more about the budget in upcoming sessions. Next week, though, we're going to focus on Bob's article. I recommend people go back and take a look at it on Substack if you get a chance. We're going to talk about privatizing the housing market. And actually what that means is trying to get government to less regulate it. Gentlemen, thanks again for being here today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Take care.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.